The cart crashed into the square, wheels splintering against cobbles, and a crowd recoiled at the sight of a body mounted on a plank. That single image spread fear through the market like spilled ink. The documentary narrator watched from the edge of the crowd as guards formed a ring, and the narrator's notes began with measured lines. Time, names, the shape of the wound. The immediate problem was visible and simple. The magistrate had chosen to display a corpse as punishment, and the town needed to know why. Fear guided the first responses. Merchants shuttered stalls. Children were pulled behind skirts. A widow in a wool shawl moved forward until a guard stepped between her and the mounted corpse. This fear would harden into suspicion and then outrage before the night ended. The crowd's first reaction became an unfolding sequence of choices. The magistrate's herald had already posted the sealed decree at the market cross. The herald's voice echoed in the square as he read the opening line, and the words framed the act as civic necessity. The documentary narrator noted the herald's phrasing and the precise placement of the seal, recording details as evidence rather than commentary. The narrator had catalogued punishments before, but never so many townspeople gathered in one place with such visible unease. He had lived in the county for 2 years, kept a ledger of official acts and private complaints, and he carried a worn notebook and a quill. His role was to record, and his presence meant an event could become a permanent line in a ledger or vanish as rumor. A man pushed through to the plank and pointed at the corpse. "Tell me," the man shouted. "Who is this?" The herald raised his hand. "The decree names him a traitor to the market's peace," the herald said. The documentary narrator bent closer and wrote the time. The man's face tightened. His jaw worked as if preparing for a decision. Doubt crept in among the watchers, doubt about the magistrate's motives, doubt about the simple official story that a condemned criminal had been mounted for warning. That doubt shifted when a woman with a mourning kerchief shouted a name and stumbled into the circle of guards. "That is my brother," the widow cried. "You took him from his grave, magistrate. He swore no oath against you." A guard shoved her back and the widow's shawl slipped, dirt falling from the edge as proof she had come running from a grave. The crowd made room for the widow's insistence. Documentary narrator recorded every exchange of names, every step back and forth. He watched how the magistrate's officers managed bodies and words with equal care. The early encounter forced an immediate choice in the square. Accept the decree and its justification or refuse and provoke force. The magistrate's strategy, public display, public control, depended on a single public acquiescence. Inside the magistrate's hall later that evening, the magistrate placed the sealed roll on the table and pressed his signet into wax with a measured thumb. He did not look up. "We need the bodies visible on the road by nightfall," he told the scribe. The scribe dipped his quill and copied the order with neat, practical strokes. The herald lined up outside the chamber doors, his face pale from the cold and dim candlelight. The documentary narrator described the room as a place of decisions. Stone bench, a single brazier, a stool for the scribe. The room's objects mattered because the magistrate used them to stage authority. A scribe named Thomas leaned forward and asked, "Magistrate, will the town not see this as vengeance?" The magistrate's fingers tightened on the decree. "Thomas," he said, "we have to hold the roads. If 2 bodies need to be mounted to slow a smuggling band, mount 2. If one must die again in the earth, so be it. Order is first." The magistrate's voice was raspy, careful, the voice of someone used to announcing decisions. Thomas paused, then wrote the words asked of him. The narrator wrote the exchange in full. The dialogue demonstrated priorities rather than sentiments. That night, under a knife, silver moon, a gravedigger named Allen and 2 town guards opened the earth and took a body that had lain shallow in its grave. Allen's hands smelled of wet earth. His shoulders moved with the physical ache of lifting. The documentary narrator noted the angle of the shovels and the particular stitch marks that marked the body's clothing. Action replaced conjecture. The grave was real, the body was real, and the secret theft from consecrated ground was deliberate. The removal introduced a second emotion shift in the chapter, suspicion turning into disgust, and it changed choices. Guards moved with new urgency. Allen wiped his palms on a rag and hissed. "The parish said we should not do this at all," one guard replied. "Orders from the magistrate outrank parish warnings tonight." The gravedigger's answer came as a small, focused action. He tied a leather cord around the wrists of the dead to secure them to the plank. In the stone courtyard behind the hall, the magistrate presided while a butcher-like attendant performed formal mutilations with a quiet, routine hand. The attendant worked with a leather apron and a set of small blades. He did not haggle or mutter. He followed a mechanical checklist. The magistrate watched the arrangement of limbs and the placement of a token under the jaw, an emblem meant to point accusatory fingers toward a rival house. The documentary narrator recorded the sequence without moralizing. Head turned to face the road, hands fixed to display a sign, a token placed for identification. The act was ceremony disguised as civic procedure. The magistrate touched the token and his knuckles left a dark smudge on its edge. "A butcher named Jory. How many will they see before someone stops this?" The magistrate answered, "As many as it takes for the road to be quiet." Jory's hands trembled only slightly as he tied rope. The narrative voice stayed close to action. Rope tightened, nails hammered, the plank slid into place. The narrator made note of the choice mechanics. The magistrate's command shaped the physical arrangement into a message for the living. By late night, the first line of mutilated corpses was mounted along the main thoroughfare. Torches cast hard faces into the crowd. Townsfolk gathered in shocked silence and then divided into two movements, those who stepped forward to protest and those who shuffled back under guard. A parish priest in a rough wool cassock went up to the nearest group and touched a severed hand with a cloth. He did not cry aloud. He stated, "This is not witness. This is a weapon." His voice was steady and low. The widow pushed to the front and pulled at the rope holding her brother. "Take him down," she demanded. A guard shoved her. She stumbled and called the priest's name, "Father Luck." She cried, "Make them stop." The priest answered with a single measured phrase. "Margaret, I will speak to the magistrate at dawn." Their exchange pivoted the crowd's reaction into planning. As the crowd pressed, a messenger named Ives, sent from a neighboring borough, forced his way through and examined one of the corpses. He crouched and found a small token under the jaw. A ribbon embroidered with a crest that belonged to a merchant family known for resisting the magistrate's tariffs. Ives straightened and called across the crowd, "This is not a thief's mark. This ties the body to the Coven merchants." The documentary narrator wrote the name down and paused. This discovery oriented the moral map. The token switched the assumed motive of the display from deterrence against crime to political intimidation. The crowd's doubt deepened into directed anger. The magistrate approached the display when the commotion reached its height. He moved through his guards with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You must be patient," he said, and his words were meant as a command. A townsman answered, "Magistrate, you mounted my neighbor's brother with your seal. Why?" The magistrate replied, "Because the law requires visibility to deter further breaches of order." The widow made a noise that became a question. "Who decided my brother was a threat?" The magistrate's jaw tightened. Guards raised halberds. The crowd answered with a mixture of words and pushes. Argument escalated into a physical confrontation when the widow and several townsfolk tried to unhook a body. Guards answered with clubs and force. The magistrate ordered the lines closed, and the documentary narrator described the ensuing clash with precise, clinical detail. The widow's shawl torn, a merchant's cart wheel crushed, a boy hit in the shoulder. 3 rapid exchanges of shouted lines occurred as people collided. "Let go." The widow cried, "You will not take our graves as a warning." The parish priest said, "Move back." The magistrate ordered. The action was raw and immediate. The moral ledger of the square balanced on the edge of a blade. In the middle of that chaos, a sudden, concrete reveal cut through. A man named Ives held up the embroidered ribbon and shouted the merchant family's name. The crowd fell silent in recognition. The magistrate's face flushed and then closed into a deliberate blank. A guard stepped forward and struck Ives across the face. Ives staggered, then spat blood and pointed at the magistrate. "This is an order from you," he said. The documentary narrator noted the pattern. Public display, private token, political message. The revelation turned a punitive spectacle into an act of intimidation. The crowd's outrage hardened into a plan. A small group, Widow Margaret, the parish priest luck merchant Thomas, and the messenger Ives moved together to pull one body down and examine it closely. They worked with quick hands, cutting ropes, prying nails, and calling the narrator's attention to thread, stitch, and plake. Their actions produced a mid-chapter mini-cliffhanger. Under the shoulder, wrapped in cloth beneath the token, they found a second sealed note with a list of names, including a local councilman known to be friendly to the magistrate. The discovery changed the scale of the confrontation from private grievance to organized exposure. The narrator recorded the names and the exact folds of the paper. The detail mattered for what would follow. Word spread by torchlight to neighboring lanes. Men and women who had been silent all night took on tasks. Some tended the wounded boy, some carried water, and others went to knock on doors to fetch witnesses. The magistrate retreated to his hall to consult with his closest officers, and the documentary narrator followed at a steady distance to note how the magistrate framed the event later in private. Inside, the magistrate's face was shadowed by the brazier's light. He counted the cost rather than the morality. "Remove Thomas from the council for now," he said. "Place blame on the smuggling ring. Bribe where needed." The officers wrote what was required. The narrator recorded his phrasing precisely. The shift here was internal. Calculation replacing immediate authority as the magistrate sought to reassert control. By dawn, the square lay emptied of its crowd but not of consequences. Blood had dried on cobbles. Ropes and crushed flowers marked where people had fought and grieved. The documentary narrator walked the display line and inspected the bodies again, this time noting how the magistrate's arrangement had altered the town's map. Families avoided the thoroughfare. Carts chose longer routes. The market's rhythm stuttered. The magistrate closed the council chamber doors and returned alone to the sealed decree. He read the list of names that had been discovered, his fingers tracing a single name at the bottom. The narrator watched from a sliver of corridor and wrote that the magistrate's hand lingered on that name a fraction longer than the others. Outside the hall, a widow paced and then sat on a low bench. Her hands folded into one another until the knuckles went white. "Father Luck," she said, addressing the priest who had come to her side. "What will you do when the magistrate punishes you for speaking?" The priest set his jaw. "I will go to the bishop, Margaret. I will not keep silent this time." Their exchange was small, a pair of decisions forming the next step of resistance. The narrator captured the priest's rhythm and the widow's sharp inhalations. Emotion was visible in those bodily details, not in long claims. The final scene of the chapter closes with a deliberate, concrete action. The magistrate took the sealed decree from the desk, folded it once more, and then placed it into a cedar chest already lined with receipts and bribes. He turned the key, and the sound of the lock was dense in the quiet room. At the same moment, in the square, a hired man lifted a plank and carried a body away in the prawn-dawn light while a child spied from a shuttered window. The documentary narrator wrote the image down. The closed chest, the removed body, the child who later would repeat what she had seen. The chapter ends on that double action, vaulting secrecy and the small witness, because both would determine how the town read the night's violence. The immediate conflict had been resolved. The bodies were taken down, the magistrate retained physical control, and the ledger was filled with names that threatened his authority. But the moral consequence was unsettled, a problem moving toward the next day. The magistrate's hand left a smudge on the seal, and beyond the hall a whisper began to spread among those who had watched the cart crash into the square. Before dawn, the magistrate drove iron through a wrist and ordered the corpse lifted onto the plank for the square. Fear tightened the documentary narrator's fingers on his quill. He set the nib to paper and kept writing while men hefted the body. Guards moved with the practiced silence of people who had done this work many times. A rope scraped leather as the desecrated was arranged where morning light would find him. The magistrate spoke once, sharp and low, and the guards obeyed. In those first moments the conflict was visible, a public spectacle being prepared, and a witness recording it as law and warning. He had arrived at the Guildhall courtyard with the record book under his cloak, expecting to take notes for a legal registry. He had not expected the magistrate to signal for the body to be displayed before any council could be convened. The documentary narrator watched the ritual instruction and marked the sequence: incision, emblem, fastening, placement. He wrote because he wanted an accurate record. He also wrote because fear of what that display could do to the town made him methodical rather than sentimental. The stakes were concrete. A body on a plank, a message nailed into public sight, and a town with decisions to make. The courtyard smelled of damp stone and tallow. The magistrate's voice cut through the fog of torches, set him facing the road. The magistrate's words were short: leave the emblem visible. The documentary narrator recorded the order and the names of the officers who oversaw the fastenings. He did not intervene. He did not ask permission. His role, he believed, was to witness and to list. A cart had crashed into the square 2 days earlier. The narrator's notes from that day sat folded in his pocket. The cart's axle had splintered and the body it carried had rattled over cobbles mounted on plank, presenting itself to the market like a sign. People had recoiled then. The memory of that scene informed every choice the narrator made now: where to stand, which route the crowd would take, how close a mourner might rush before guards moved. He used the cart crash details to position himself and to predict the crowd's reaction. His notebook held concrete entries: time, wheel fracture, witness names, one broken vendor stall. He added the new entries with the same measured hand. The magistrate fastened a stitched insignia over the chest of the desecrated. The stitch was crude but deliberate, a repeated pattern, thread pulled tight through leather, a mark that would identify an affiliation. A townsman near the back pointed and said, "That's the merchant's smark." The documentary narrator wrote the townsman's name and the merchant's title. He tilted his head to catch the exchange. His pen scratched, the concrete clues multiplied. Stitch pattern, clothing remnants, the way the ears had been torn. Each detail changed the interpretation of the body from anonymous warning to targeted message. The morning brightened as the magistrate ordered the guards to secure a perimeter. A young guard, the guard captain's sergeant, tightened ropes and whispered to another, "If anyone touches him, take them away." The guard's voice was plain and hard. The documentary narrator recorded the instruction and the guard's name. He watched the magistrate's hand brush the ceremonial knife at his belt, the ring catching torchlight. The magistrate kept his face composed. He spoke in degrees of control. "This will stand 3 days," he told the captain. "No one retrieves the body until I say." The captain nodded and barked orders. Dawn brought a woman running up the Guildhall steps, her skirts muddied, voice thin with breath. She pushed past a huddle of townsfolk and reached for the foot of the plank.
"You cannot do this!"
she cried. The documentary narrator noted the woman by name where possible. The crowd later identified her as the desecrated sister-in-law, a peasant named Mare. She seized the plank with both hands and tried to tilt the body toward herself. A guard's gauntlet closed on her arm. "Mare," the guard said, using the name aloud to slow the motion. "You cannot." The guard's grip tightened. "Step back or I'll bind you," Mare answered with a short, animal sound of a word and reached anyway.
"You promised an inquiry!"
She shouted at the magistrate. "You promised not to display him. You promised." The magistrate lifted his chin. "Mare," he said, the name clipped. "Your promise was to obey when ordered. Leave now, or you will be treated as a disturber of peace." The guard pushed her free and dragged her down the steps. A woman in the crowd tried to help. The magistrate's men shoved 2 people into a narrow alley and the body swung, head lolling, mouth open, at the angle of the light. The documentary narrator wrote each name, each shove, each shouted sentence. He broke eye contact with Mare only to copy down the knotted rope work used to raise the plank. He noted how the stitched emblem matched a merchant banner he'd seen in the market yesterday. The day before, the cart crash had alerted vendors, traders, and local officials. Now the emblem connected the desecrated to a merchant allied with a local noble. This stitch turned the display into a message not just to peasants but to factional power. By mid-morning, whispers shifted the mood in the courtyard. A townsman called Torin stepped forward and pointed at the threadwork. That stitch is from House Calder. They trade at the Northern Quay. The documentary narrator recorded Torin's claim and watched the magistrate's jaw tighten where a thin scar ran along his cheek. The magistrate did not say Calder aloud. He kept his hands folded and his tone controlled when he spoke to the guard captain. Record the witness. Find the ledger entries for deliveries by Calder. A breathless town messenger arrived and handed a sealed letter to the magistrate in the antechamber. The messenger had dust on his boots, lines of fatigue on his face. He cleared his throat and spoke to the magistrate while someone held the doors. "There is word from the garrison at the ford," he said. "They request explanation. And Lord Calder's steward demands an audience." The magistrate broke the seal and read. His eyes flicked to the crowd and then to the narrator. The narrator wrote the phrase the messenger repeated, and then copied the magistrate's reply word for word. "We act to keep order." The magistrate read the letter aloud, more to the assembly than to the messenger. "We have attracted notice from above and from neighboring interests," he pronounced. The sentence added a new pressure. Higher authorities watched and factions stirred. The documentary narrator underlined the passage in his own hand, noting the time. His pen left dark indentations on the next page. A rumor leapt then. The desecrated had been a merchant who defied a promised immunity.
Mayor screamed a name! Calder!
And townsfolk repeated it. Voices split the crowd. Some muttered that the magistrate had finally enforced the law. Others hissed that he had used the law to settle a private score. The documentary narrator moved among the edges of the gathering to catch fragments of conversation, to place faces with names. He observed how people chose sides. Those who owed taxes to Calder stepped back, while stallholders who feared arbitrary penalty edged forward. The survivor mayor returned after being pulled away, her skirt damp and her hands trembling. She stood on the Guildhall steps and looked at the magistrate. "You promised justice," she said, "not this mockery." Her voice did not crack, but the documentary narrator saw the tremor in her fingers. The magistrate answered with a formality used in public pronouncements. "We mete out punishment that will persuade others," he said. "That is the law here." The words landed like flat stones. He invoked order and deterrent. Mayor named grief and promise. Between them the crowd shifted its allegiance. An altercation began near the plank. A man from the rear pushed forward and grabbed at a foot of the desecrated. A guard seized him and twisted his arm. Several townsfolk surged. The guard captain bellowed orders, "Hold the line." He struck a man with the flat of his palm to set him back. The documentary narrator catalogued the injuries as they occurred, listing bruises, a split lip, the guard's whip marks. He counted the pace of the fight. 3 pushes, 2 arrests, 1 weapon brandished, then lowered. The clash was brief but fierce, and the crowd's mood hardened from shocked curiosity into furious resistance. 3 times the documentary narrator felt a shift within himself, from professional detachment into uneasy suspicion, then into active alarm as the crowd found a target, and finally into grim clarity when he saw how quickly order could become violence. Each shift changed how he wrote. At first he used clipped, clinical entries. Then his handwriting grew faster, the lines slanting. Finally he fixed details with surgical care, names, wounds, the guard who had used excessive force. The emotional changes did not sit as labels. They moved his hand, altered his breathing, and dictated which facts he prioritized. At midday the survivor pointed at a man in a roadside apron and said, "You know him? Your ledger shows a delivery on the 10th, a merchant called Hendra." Cornered by the accusation, "Spat at her, you lie," he said. "I merely moved goods." Mayor stepped toward him. Hendra shoved her in the chest. 2 guards pulled Hendra aside but did not arrest him. The crowd felt the uneven enforcement. The documentary narrator recorded the slightness of Hendra's push and wrote down the guards' reluctance to detain him. This inconsistency was a new fact. The display enforced the magistrate's choice, but enforcement itself could be selective. The town messenger reappeared, breathless again. He carried a new scrap, a folded note that quoted a steward. The magistrate read and then tightened his jaw. "They applaud the measure," he said aloud, and then, without addressing Mayor's accusation directly, he announced a public inquest to be held in 3 days. The announcement was engineered to sound like restraint. The documentary narrator noted the date and the clerk who would record minutes. He watched the magistrate step back from the plank and saw the satisfaction in a slight upward curl at his mouth. As afternoon edged toward the height of the day, the crowd's murmurs swelled. Someone in the back produced a memory of the cart crash that had spilled a body across the market 2 days prior and compared it to the current spectacle. "They did the same thing then, Torin, they want us afraid." The words became a thread that linked the two events. The narrator compared entries and found parallels: public placement, emblematic marks, and rapid orders to restrict grieving. The pattern suggested a policy rather than a one-off act. A young townsman climbed onto a barrel and shouted, "Tear it down!" The magistrate's face did not move. He gestured to the guard captain. "Do as you must," he told him. The captain's men formed a wedge and struck outward. The crowd pushed back. The wedge collapsed under pressure. The documentary narrator recorded the order, and then paused when a knife flashed at the edge of the crowd. Someone struck a light blow to a guard's arm. A guard drew a baton and hit back. The courtyard turned into pain and shouting. The narrator's pen was nearly consumed with names and brief actions. Man with knife, guard with baton, woman with torn sleeve, child knocked down. Rapid lines of dialogue followed in the crush. Voices overlapped. "Let him go."
Mayor shouted no.
The guard captain barked, "Hold them." A guard ordered, "We will not stand for this." The magistrate called out. The back and forth accelerated. 3 to 6 quick exchanges, sharp and truncated. The documentary narrator kept writing while shielding his book from splatter and scuffle. He watched the ceremonial knife flash in the magistrate's hand as he moved forward. The knife's point caught a strip of cloth from a bystander's sleeve. Someone screamed. The momentum of the crowd turned toward violence. The climax arrived as the crowd surged together with the intent to pull the body down and retrieve the desecrated from the plank. The guard captain ordered the guards to form ranks and to push the crowd back. A volley of force met a packed human mass. The result was immediate. 3 people fell under boots, 2 men had their heads split open on cobbles, and a woman, Mayor, was shoved and landed against a stone column. The documentary narrator observed and recorded the moments in tight bursts. Sound of bones hitting stone, a man's breathing cut off by a knee, the guard captain giving the order to strike to maintain the display. When the melee ended, the courtyard smelled of blood and dust. The magistrate stood with the ceremonial knife in hand and the heavy signet ring visible on his finger. He pronounced a decree then, his tone official and final. "Let this stand as notice. Any who remove the body will face consequence." The guard sergeant read out names of those arrested. The documentary narrator listed injuries, binding the physical facts with legal notation. 2 detained for assault, 1 for resisting a peace officer, 3 taken for questioning. After the scuffle, the court restored a brittle order. The townsfolk gathered at edges, nursing bruises, dragging children up from where they had been forced to the cobbles. The documentary narrator methodically catalogued wounds, asked for names, and wrote down the magistrate's threats, recording the exact phrasing used when he promised wider displays. He Mayor for a statement. She spoke with a voice stripped of its earlier pitch. "He was a merchant for Calder," she said. "They sent him to teach us to obey." The documentary narrator wrote every word and asked short, factual follow-ups. "When did you see him last? Who else saw him?" The day ended with one final act. As dusk gathered, the magistrate ordered a single weathered stake driven into the earth on the town edge, where passers-by would see it. He motioned to the guard captain, who had a new hardness in his face. They drove the stake until the head of it struck solid wood and soil. The documentary narrator watched the motion and wrote the circumference of the stake, the remnant of cloth tied at the top, and the way the light from the last candle hallowed the magistrate's profile. He closed his notebook after listing names and wounds and the decrease wording, sealing the day's record. He left the Guildhall and walked past the place where the cart had broken 2 nights ago. The vendor stall still bore a jagged mark on its frame from the cart wheel. He folded the new notes into the old packet and traced the sequence. Cart crash into the square. A body on a plank then. Today, a deliberate display with emblem and stake. The pattern suggested policy. The magistrate used public mutilation and the spectacle of the desecrated to shape obedience. Before he reached his lodgings, the documentary narrator made a final notation. Names of the magistrate's retainers who had taken the lead, the guard captain's garrison strength, the time the stake had been driven. He added a short Latin phrase the magistrate had used in public, pro pax et ordo, and underlined it. He did not feel rhetorical about the underlining. It was a factual marker. He placed the packet into a small pouch and tightened the cord. He had recorded a verdict. He had not stopped the violence. That gap between record and remedy sat as a concrete fact on his page. He would return to these pages and read them aloud to other clerks and to any authority who would listen. For now the town slept around the stake and the plank, and the desecrated kept his silence. The chapter ends with the magistrate's order echoing in the dawn that would come. A stake at the road, a plank in the square, names written down, and a community rearranged by visible threat. The documentary narrator closed his notebook on the courtyard's final scene, the nail heads shining, and he prepared to trace where those names would lead next. Torches flared as the braided corpse was borne into the stone courtyard, and he felt suspicion tighten his fingers around the quill. He had watched a cart crash into the square, wheels splintering against cobbles, and he had seen iron driven through a wrist before dawn. Those 2 images sat beside each other in his notes like stubborn stains. Suspicion led him forward now. The documentary narrator moved inside the ring of guards until his cloak brushed the dais. He recorded each step with a calm hand, because the paper mattered when a body could be rewritten into a lesson. The crowd pressed close, faces lit by flicker. The magistrate stood on the dais in muted crimson robes, ceremonial knife at his hip, and he read the room as he always did, measured, public, unyielding. The central problem lay plain within those first moments. The town was being asked to accept a corpse as a deliberate proclamation of power, not a record of guilt. The narrator's work was to watch that claim break or hold. He wrote while the executioners adjusted the braid and tied the hands. The desecrated lay arranged with hands crossed over a plank, hair woven into a tight rope down the back, stitch marks visible at the temple. The narrator touched the edge of the torn peasant garb and felt the coarse linen grit under his fingertips. He smelled stale blood and damp earth. His notes recorded facts. Time, torch count, the magistrate's seal on the decree roll. He also recorded reaction. A man near the market stall swallowed hard and spat on the ground. The magistrate unrolled his sealed decree and lifted his chin. People of the town, he called, voice rasping. Let this stand where law has spoken. Let every hand that thinks to steal, to murder, to conspire, let them see what follows. The line of guards tightened. A woman shouted, "This is a man, not a message." A guard cuffed her mouth with the flat of a palm. She tasted iron and dust. The narrator paused, then wrote the woman's name when someone nearby hissed it, martyr of the blacksmith lane. The crowd's first reaction split between rote compliance and a slow hardening doubt. That doubt was the first emotional shift. Suspicion had opened into uncertainty among the townsfolk. The narrator recorded the doubt in short sentences. He did not invent outrage. He logged it when it appeared as a change in posture or a held breath. Executioners worked with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. They bound wrists to the plank and threaded a braided length of hair through a loop of rope. One executioner, gaunt and with ink, stained fingertips from earlier record keeping, hummed a tune under his breath. The magistrate's ceremonial knife flashed as he indicated the final placement. The narrator leaned close enough to read a scrubbed symbol stitched into a scrap near the collar, indistinct at first. Then clearly a mark he had seen before on the edge of a sealed paper in the magistrate's office. A junior officer stepped forward holding a folded petition. He cleared his throat. "Magistrate," he said, voice breaking, "this man was named in a complaint. The House of Duran points its finger, but we have testimony naming others. The desecrated was taken from the Duran courtyard 2 nights ago." The magistrate's jaw tightened. "Read it, then." The magistrate. The junior officer unfolded the petition with hands that shook. He read one line aloud. "They took him to settle a debt, then left him for the guards to claim." The words hit the magistrate's face like wind. Voices rippled through the crowd. The magistrate barked silence, and the guards moved like a curtain closing. The narrator's pen scratched faster. This was the second external event in short succession. It pushed the scene from spectacle toward accusation. The magistrate named the desecrated a thief and traitor and recited the decree that gave the town license to display him. He spoke of order and deterrence. He did not speak of evidence. When a townsman called, "Where is Duran's witness?" a guard seized him and hauled him back toward the alleys. The magistrate watched the man go, then turned to the narrator as if to say, in a tone low and measured, "You have little to write if you do not record this." The narrator met his eye and kept writing. Preparing the desecration took time and close hands. The narrator inspected the stitch marks along the jawline and found threads that matched the magistrate's seal in color and twine. He did not announce the match. He copied the thread pattern into the margin. Executioners braided the hair in a practiced rhythm. One of them muttered, "They taught us to weave the face into the message." The narrator wrote the phrase down in cold font. It was not a metaphor, it was a step in their method. The court's mood shifted as the junior officer produced a second folded sheet. He handed it to a trusted aide who stood near the magistrate. The aide wore a heavy signet ring and a dull gold sash. The trusted aide glanced at the paper, then froze. He did not read aloud. The narrator noticed the trusted aide's hesitation and wrote. Trusted aide halted. Ring finger pale where it grips the vellum. The presence of that hesitation deepened the emotional changes. Suspicion advanced into a sharper form, now edged with dread and the potential for exposure. The magistrate stepped forward and pointed the ceremonial knife at the plank. "Hear the law," he intoned. "Let the town remember." A child in the front row began to cry. A merchant spat and said, "Hear the law indeed." He paid the guards more than thrice his due. The narrator recorded names again. Marta, Thumb the merchant, and the child, little Elias, who clutched at his mother's skirt. A hand at the courtyard edge shifted. A voice cut through. "There is a seal soon inside his collar," the junior officer said. The narrator moved before the magistrate could notice and slipped a finger into the torn edge of the desecrated's shirt. He felt the rough knot of thread and pulled free a scrap. The guard nearest him gripped his arm. "Hands off," the guard said. The narrator kept his voice steady. "Let me see the mark. I record this for the council." He did not ask permission. They seized the junior officer instead. The magistrate's command came quick, and the guards moved like a single instrument. He ordered the officer bound and suggested doubling punishments for any who challenged the display. The crowd's mood toward the magistrate tightened again. Fear returned, but threaded with a new question. Why hide a seal? The narrator's hand trembled around the quill, not from fear of the rope, but from the sudden clarity of a possible fabrication. When the guards roughly restrained the narrator for lifting the scrap, the town's reaction shifted once more. A trusted aide who had held the petition for a moment stepped away from the magistrate and, with a single quick motion, threw the torn token into the torchlight. It spun through the air and landed at the magistrate's feet. Everyone saw the emblem. The narrator shouted, "Stop!" and the word cut the square into sharp pieces of movement. The emblem was small and soon in dark thread. Under the torchlight, the looped glyph read like the magistrate's own seal. The messenger of records in the magistrate's office used that same mark on official detainments. The trusted aide, called Lorik in the records the narrator carried, spoke then. "It bears your hand, magistrate," he said. The magistrate's face went still as water. He barked, "Lorik, you lie." "Guards, take him." Lorik stepped back, ring hand open. "I do not lie," he said. "I served with you at the mill. I watched you sign those rolls. I saw the thread in the office yesterday. A woman yelled, "Traitor!" and then, "Lying traitor?" As two sides in the crowd found words sharp enough to wound, argument broke out in clipped exchanges. The required rapid back and forth arrived as men near the dais argued in short sentences. "You stole my son," a market woman cried. "You sold him to them," another answered. Lorik explained. The magistrate demanded. He signed the paper himself. "Lorik, I signed to keep order." The magistrate, "Order by death is not law." The merchant spat. Guards surged. The narrator recorded each short line with names attached. The argument lasted fewer than 2 minutes, but in that span the authority the magistrate had cultivated showed hairline cracks. That exchange served as a mini cliffhanger in the middle of the chapter. No one yet knew whether the magistrate would close ranks or be undone. The magistrate chose suppression. He ordered Lorik seized. The guards closed around Lorik with ropes and shouted for silence. A scuffle began. The narrator wrote the movement. Lorik forced his hand up, pointing at the emblem on the scrap. A guard swung a club. Lorik ducked. A stone split a vendor's stall. People ran toward alleys. The magistrate called for calm and then, in a measured voice, proposed doubling the penalties for anyone found to have helped the desecrated. That decision was public, brutal, and immediate. At that moment the narrator stepped closer and pressed the scrap against the torch. The emblem, now in the open, glared like a brand. He read the initials beneath it. The magistrate's office again, and then an aide, pale and sweating, whispered. He planted it. He had the Duran family arrested 2 nights ago to supply a body. He wanted the deterrent. The narrator felt his pulse move. The emotional arc shifted again, from suspicion to outrage, then to immediate fear as the magistrate sought to reclaim control through increased cruelty. A trusted magistrate aide, called Jora in earlier lists, moved behind the magistrate and dropped a folded ledger on the dais. She pushed it, forcing the magistrate to glance down. "Look at the record," she said. "Look at the dates. Look at the summons." The magistrate's mouth shaped a word and then closed. He looked at the crowd and his voice lost its steadiness for the first time. The crowd sensed the falter. A man in the back shouted, "Show us the summons!" The narrator recorded the names. Lorik and Jora both appeared in his notes multiple times. The crowd ruptured. Some villagers lunged toward the guards. Others fell back and watched with raw faces. The magistrate tried to shout and failed. Lorik, bound, spat a line that changed how people saw the whole display. "You killed him to have a warning. You chose the corpse. You forged the seal for show." His words landed like a stone. The narrator wrote them down and underlined them. That was the twist, the concrete reveal that rewrote earlier events. The magistrate had not merely authorized a display. He had engineered the display. Guards pushed into the crowd and the narrator had to step sideways to avoid a scuffle. Someone grabbed his cloak and threatened his quill. He kept his hand open and let the ink blot his palm rather than let them take the notes. A merchant, shoved a guard, then froze when the guard's club rose. Marta stepped forward and slapped the guard's face. "Marta!" A woman gasped. "Marta, you will not use my son as a lesson." The narrator recorded Marta's name with the slap as evidence of a town shifting from fear to open resistance. The magistrate lunged for Lorik, but an officer intercepted. The narrator said in a low voice, "Record the seal. Record the ledger entries. Count the torches." He barked the inventory like an order to himself. He had to secure the evidence while the chaos rebalanced authority. Jora pushed a page from the ledger across the dais and read aloud a summons dated 2 evenings prior naming the Darren household and signed with the magistrate scribble. The page confirmed Lorik's accusation in cold black ink. When the magistrate tried to deny the ledger, a young scribe from the registry stepped forward. "I copied that roll," she said. "He signed it here in my presence." "He me to redact costs." Her voice did not tremble. The narrator watched the magistrate's shoulders slump a fraction. The crowd's volume rose. The emotional movement had run through suspicion, doubt, outrage, and now into a brittle hope for justice. The magistrate reached for the ceremonial knife as if to restore ceremony, but a stone hit his sleeve and tore the cloth. The crowd's reaction forced the guards to back off. The magistrate shouted, "Guards," but his voice found no echo on the stone. He had made the body into a proclamation, but the proclamation had exposed his own hand. The narrator watched him pivot from command to calculation. The aftermath began with arrests and with people fleeing. Some pulled the desecrated from the plank and started to carry him toward the shadows. Unknown hands moved quick, and the narrator noted a small team, 3 men, who slipped the body away. He wrote their gait, their rope belts, the way they lifted the corpse under its arms. The magistrate barked for pursuit, but hesitated. He feared that chases would spread the ledger and the seal further. At the alley mouth, a woman kneeled beside the desecrated, fingers probing for name tags. She found a burned scrap with a child's handwriting. "I work for Darren." She read it aloud. "He wrote this," she said, voice low. "He was forced." The narrator wrote it down and circled the line. The crowd gathered around the small moment like moths around a flame. It was concrete proof against a public narrative. Outside the courtyard, a guard set a net to block escape. The magistrate realized he had miscalculated the social ledger of fear. He had assumed the people would accept spectacle without question. Instead, the spectacle birthed a chain of questions he could not fully control. The narrator recorded the decision that followed. The magistrate ordered extra patrols and the sealing of the registry for the night. This was a tactical move to buy time. The narrator walked the alleys after the crowd dissipated. He checked the ledger again in the torchlight and matched the thread colors to the stitch marks on the desecrated's collar scrap. He penned a list of names that would anchor any inquiry: Lorik, Jorah, Marta, Thumb alias Mother. He interviewed 2 men who had carried the body away. They spoke in clipped sentences. "We hid him under the baker's carts," one said. "We stripped the braid and took the rope apart," the other added. The narrator wrote the location and the times. Every concrete detail formed a map out of rumor. At the baker's yard, the desecrated was laid on coarse straw. The narrator wiped his quill on parchment and looked at the face that had been made into a message. There were stitch marks along the temple and a torn ear. His mouth hung open with a slackness that did not speak of words. The narrator touched the braided hair and saw that someone had threaded a thin silver strip into it, a sign not of peasant frugality, but of deliberate presentation. The presence of silver in the braid was another small surprise that changed the assumption about how the corpse had been furnished. Jorah came to the yard with a small satchel and stood apart from the others. She looked at the desecrated and then at the narrator. "You have his notes?" she asked. Her voice was tight. The narrator nodded and handed her a folded page. "Lorik saved me a spool of thread once," she said. "He kept small things from the registry." He was uneasy about how the magistrate used them. Her tone suggested layers. She had not acted until now. That was a second shift in allegiance, and it mattered. The narrator wrote Jorah's words, then recorded her face. Pale ink, streaked, mouth set. They argued in the yard in low, urgent lines. "Lorik spoke to me at dawn. Jorah, why did he bring this to you?" The narrator asked. "He wanted someone to keep the ledger safe." She answered, "You kept it here." The narrator said, "Only until morning," she replied. The exchange lasted 6 short lines. It clarified roles and set the next decision. The ledger must be delivered to the council at first light, or it would be seized by the magistrate's men. The narrator and Jorah agreed to move at dawn. That decision resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. They would secure the proof. Before they left the yard, Marta returned with Thumb at her side. She laid a scrap of fabric on the straw and said, "He wore this when they took him. It belonged to Darren's boy." Thumb cursed under his breath and then said, "We will tell the council. We will make them rid the ledger." The narrator listened and wrote the pledged steps. The town had shifted from passive fear to collective action in small, precise movements. As they moved into the deeper alleys, the narrator sealed his notes and tucked the ledger page into his cloak. His hand smelled of ink and of the blood dried on the desecrated's collar. He felt the weight of evidence and the new danger that weight carried. His suspicion had become responsibility. He had moved from observer to participant by the act of lifting a scrap and risking a guard's blow. That night the magistrate retreated to his private chamber and burned papers. He summoned 2 captains and ordered a sweep for the ledger. Lorik was led in chains and spat accusations that men would carry into taverns and stalls. The town slept poorly. The narrator did not sleep at all. He copied ledger entries by lantern and numbered each line for witnesses. He planned routes where to meet Jorah and how to present the ledger so the council could not deny the handwriting. At dawn they went. They moved in small groups and kept aside streets. The narrator and Jorah delivered the ledger to the council hall. They found the hall occupied by a half-dozen elders who had not yet taken sides. The narrator set the ledger on the table and jutted his chin toward the seal. He spoke plainly. "This ledger and these summons show who ordered the Darren seizure. Read them aloud, count the dates, mark the signatures." He did not beg. He presented. The council read. Voices rose and fell. One elder, old Rimmon, looked at the magistrate's seal and then at the faces in the hall. If this is true, justice will not be the magistrate's alone." The narrator watched the elder's hand as it smoothed the page. The emotional arc arrived at closure. The town would either hold the magistrate to account or return to the old calculus of fear. The narrator left the hall with a ledger copy in his hand and names on his lips. Outside, a messenger hurried toward the square. The magistrate's men were gathering. The narrator and Jorah did not wait for a formal summons. They went to the square. The magistrate stood where he had been, robes slightly dusted, knife at his hip. He met their eyes, and for the first time the narrator heard true doubt in the magistrate's voice. "You will bring charges?" he asked. "We will show the council evidence," the narrator said. "Then the law will decide," the magistrate answered. He looked to his guards. "Keep order. Do not let them burn what remains," the narrator nodded. He had fulfilled the chapter's immediate arc. From public spectacle to expose fraud to a formal process initiated. At dusk some unknown hands pried the desecrated from where the crowd had left him and carried him away into a shadowed lane. The narrator watched the men, wrote their gait, and noted where they vanished. He sealed his final page and penned a last line for the night. The warning the magistrate intended had survived as rumor and fear, but the real warning now would be in paper, in ledger lines, and in names read aloud in a hall where law might yet shift. He closed his notebook, cased the quill, and felt an exhaustion that no candle could ease. He had been detached, clinical, and now he carried the burden of an inked accusation. The chapter ended on a concrete beat. Lorik was taken to the lockhouse. Jorah left with the ledger copy. Marta and them stood at the market gate. The desecrated's body was gone into the dark. The narrator walked away with the list of names he had written, knowing the next morning would bring counsel and confrontation, and knowing he had altered the story by choosing to lift a scrap from the collar. The record remained, an emblem sewn with the magistrate's thread, a ledger with dates and signatures, and a town that had found. In the space between a cart's crash and an iron through a wrist, the will to ask who actually made the warning. The narrator sealed those facts into his notes and into the memory that would be carried by others. He would testify if called. He closed the chapter of that night on the sound of distant bell ropes and the scrape of boots on stone.